Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to anybody who's joining us from the other side of the world. Welcome to the Data Economics Festival 2021. Thank you so much for giving us your time this afternoon. This week-long Thought Leadership Festival is going to bring you some really deep and meaningful conversations around how the confluence of digital data and economics is transforming the world that we currently live in. Before we go ahead, a couple announcements. If you want to learn what other sessions are around, please visit lydian.com/festival. Today, there is a fun cocktail mixology after the sessions. Tomorrow, there's a golf clinic and some live music sing-along. So if you're up here for some good social events, virtual social events, please do join us. So today's session's topic that is on applying distributed data and federated analytics to health sciences. I know these are some really heavy keywords, but it's quite interesting when we come to data to understand what opportunities, challenges, and successes are around in this space. So I want to welcome our esteemed panelists today who will share some of their real world use cases that they have been part of and give us some insights. We will take an open 10 minutes after the end of their talk as an open Q&A session, but please feel free to type in any questions that you may have in the chat box during the session, and we'll do our best to bring them up for everybody. And if you have any other questions about the session, about the conversation, about the topic, please also feel free to type into me or to Sartaj, who's my assistant moderator and helping with some technical issues if you have. Well then, let's meet our panelists today. The first up is Chris. Chris is a blockchain expert. He forms blockchain-based businesses and networks and ecosystems, mostly with focus on IBM's HealthPass platform. He represents IBM's blockchain and ecosystem point of view to congressional, federal agencies and states. And we'll be hearing from him about his experience working with the state of New York in a little bit. Next up is Charles. He is an early stage tech and healthcare executive and investor. He's the CEO of Arcus Health, a COVID-19 response consultancy that has built solutions for companies and governments in the US. He's also done quite a bit of business for companies in China and in US. So we'll learn about his experience working on data in different countries and how they all compare. And then TANVI, let's all congratulate her. She's a prospective PhD candidate at Cambridge University, and her research is going to be focusing on prognosis, diagnostics, and precision therapeutics for developing predictive models and related to clinical imaging for some really spectacular diseases, which I can't pronounce. So prior to her PhD, TANVI has been in strategic consulting for life sciences and healthcare clients across the country, supporting digital data and transformation initiatives. Last but not the least, I am a digital patient experience product manager at Center for Digital Health Innovations at UCSF. We are using distributed data and analytics to understand the differences in experience of various patient groups in different hospital settings, in different clinic settings, and are building data-driven solutions to help improve patient experience and overall patient access and care. If you want to learn more about what we do at CDHI, please do reach out to me. And that's my pitch. So I'm going to start with you, Chris. And before I do that, is everybody good? Everybody has access, no questions? I don't see any questions popping up on chat. So Great, I'll start. So Chris, I wanted to ask you about the work that you did with the state of New York and how you facilitated the democratization of data for the COVID-19 response team.
Yeah, so for those of you not familiar with it, New York was the first state to actually roll out a health credential. And this was in conjunction with the governor's office. And it's really an ability of patients to take control of their health data and how they represent it. So what we did with them is go into the immunization gateway and the testing databases that are being populated at the state level. So if you're a New York resident and you are vaccinated or you get a test result, that gets reported up to the state. And almost every state has a similar construct. And so we worked with the state to take that piece of information and allow people to represent it either digitally or via a piece of paper, and to take that with them. So as we look at what's going on right now with COVID and the questions on university campuses or traveling abroad of how do you represent your COVID status, that's what we were able to help the state of New York address. And it was a lot of very interesting questions about how do you treat the data? How do you make sure that the data is appropriately secured? How do you not go build a large database in the sky, but how do you actually really decentralize access to this information? And it was a really interesting use case. And I haven't talked at all about the technology, and I'm really not going to, other than saying it was some very interesting cryptography and blockchain. And what it allows us to do is to take that piece of data and to really push it out to the edge. So I would say very much like Web 1.0 and Web 2.0 and Web 3.0, I think health data is on a similar trajectory where we are coming out of this era of just get everything into EMRs and we're going to go build data lakes and do all this stuff on top of it. I think we're getting to a world now where it's much more accessible to patients and they can take it and use it in ways that they see fit. And that's a lot of the capabilities that we unlocked for New York and that we're unlocking for other states as well. I'll stop there and with that background on what we did and also why I think it's so important in the context of data and patients.
That's quite interesting. Did you particularly have any policy roadblocks that you came across when trying to build a digitally accessible data platform for patients? Because I remember when Blue Button was first launched, it was a nightmare, not just technologically, but also just in terms of how many HIPAA complaints had been coming up around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I think was super interesting is how do you balance HIPAA, the actual HIPAA and the boogeyman of HIPAA? Because a lot of good ideas, I think all of us on this call, be it your panelist or a participant attendee, have had good ideas that were squashed by HIPAA. And I think sometimes that's appropriate. Sometimes it's just the fear of trying something new. We were very fortunate in that we have some really good legal advice from both the state, and we're also working at it from the IBM perspective. And we're able to understand, okay, what exactly are we doing here? Is this something that's relevant for HIPAA? If we're giving information about the patient and allowing the patient to control what happens with it, what does that mean? So what we were really successful at, and I use we in a very, very broad sense, it was IBM, the state of New York, Boston Consulting Group, other entities all coming together to say, okay, what exactly do we need to enable so that a constituent in New York has this piece of information and can go about their lives in a better way? And we start to ask it in that question rather than in a HIPAA sense. Suddenly the answers become a lot more apparent and people get a lot more flexible because it's all about enabling someone to do something that's useful in their lives. Oops, I think you might be on mute there. Sorry.
As always, that's the bane of my existence. So did you come across any particular, I may say, like social determinants that affected the population and the way they had access to the data? Like, did you take into account patient age group or technical knowledge, et cetera, when building this solution?
Yeah, absolutely. Equality is at the core of what we're enabling here. So the system doesn't require someone to have a smartphone or to be technology savvy. It can be printed. So very much like the CDC card that people are walking out of vaccination sites with, you could operate the system in that exact same manner. We also made sure that we had something that was addressing minor children or adult caregiver scenarios. So how do you address that? In some ways, I think the access question is super important to address, but it's also a little bit like HIPAA in a way where we can get tripped up over it and we look at this bar that we're trying to get over and we don't really consider, is it better than where we are today? And by that, I would say, if you went to a FEMA or a National Guard run vaccination site and you lose your CDC card, what are you going to do? I don't think anyone has a good answer for that, unless you're in New York. In New York, you have a very good answer for that now. That information that the states have, whether it be New York or any other state, that information is locked up in systems that require you to go online, print a form, mail it in, and get something back about 10 to 14 days later. So really, yes, access and equality is the goal, but we just have to be better than that. And we're not even disabling that. So someone can still do that process. And what we're doing is a far better process because people might not have access to transportation. They might not be able to go to a government building. They might not be able to wait 14 days. So, you know, the equality thing is all about, are we moving the ball forward? We don't need to be 100% perfect, but we sure as heck need to move the ball forward. And we're going to be striving towards being perfect.
So do you have plans to expand this beyond New York? And would states be able to share data across?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is absolutely a platform. So we are working with other states, other countries, other industries, travel and transportation, other industries, large sporting venues. Our pilot was with Barclays and Madison Square Garden. So you can kind of extrapolate out where our thinking is on that. And it's absolutely an interoperability play. We built this based on W3C standards. And so as we look at where the market is going, we want to be interoperable with other companies that are playing in this space and with other entities that eventually want to enable this capability amongst themselves.
How have you been using or sharing the data that you're generating through this pass and sharing it with systems that can actually build analytics on it? Are you data sharing with reporting companies, with CDC? What kind of analytics is going to be used based on what Excelsior Pass is producing?
Yeah, so this is one of those moments where you have to do right from the onset because you can never unwind the clock. So we made some very conscious decisions of what kind of data we're not going to collect. So extensive information about where people are perhaps scanning passes. We don't want to get too deep into that. You could imagine a scenario where maybe you're a small business, maybe you're directionally correct on your taxes, but maybe not 100% right. You wouldn't want a scenario where someone could start to look at how many people are showing up and bounce it up against tax receipts and then start to say, well, we're going to start auditing people. Those are things that are not in public health's best interest. We certainly want everyone to pay their taxes. So let's have that as a ground truth. But we need to collect data and use it in a way that still causes people to have trust in the system and to want to use the system. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the ways that New York is and isn't using it, but I do want to just kind of stress one of the opening points that we took is this piece of data important? And is it actually going to decrease the overarching goal of putting information in people's hands so they can go about their lives? If it doesn't support that prime objective, then we really got to ask, why are we gathering this piece of data? Because while it might be interesting from a public health perspective on one very narrow subset, it might be detracting from the overall larger goals.
And so this pass is available to patients or to users on their smartphone. It's a smartphone application. What about patients who do not have access to smartphones or families who share one smartphone across
Sure. So in that scenario, let's take this one that doesn't want to use a smartphone. You can print it, which is why it's an ideal replacement for the CDC card. And if you lose your card, it's an ability for you to regenerate it. In a way, it's a nice way of getting away from the almost paternalistic relationship sometimes that we have with our provider community, where you don't have to go back to the provider and ask, hey, can I get a copy of my immunizations? Can I get this or that? You can actually do it yourself, which is, again, this notion of democratizing data, putting us in control of the ability to get it. In the caregiver scenario, so maybe I'm taking care of an elderly parent or I have a minor child, we have an ability for you to answer information about that person and through a series of challenge questions to establish if you have a legitimate need and if you truly are the appropriate caregiver and custodian of that record or not. And we worked a lot with the state on how to properly establish that.
So what additional insights you would share to somebody, say a new startup that is trying to venture out in this space, trying to build an application that is a very low-hanging fruit of sharing your own personal health data? And what would you tell them, like, to the biggest pitfalls to avoid?
I would say, make sure you're doing something that's worth doing. And so, what does that mean? It's amazing how many times people are taking the same idea and either moderately incrementing it or just trying to be better at it than someone else. And there's a lot of energy that goes into basically doing the same thing over again. And occasionally you'll have a true breakthrough. I think everyone would agree that maybe Salesforce was a true breakthrough over Oracle. If you come at it from a very technology perspective, it was a fundamentally better CRM. But let's double click on that. Did it really do anything differently? No, it was a CRM system. Okay, well then why was it better? Why did it win? It was in the delivery model. They had a fundamentally new way of delivering it. So while we might have created an app, what we really have done is a fundamentally new way of putting a patient in charge of their data and pushing that ability to the edge. So you don't have these centralized repositories of data in the sky. You don't have to go talk to your provider to get this piece of information. The patient, even though it's an app just like it might have been before, the innovation is that it's now out on the edge and that they're in full control of it. Much like Salesforce's big innovation wasn't a new CRM, it was in the delivery of that CRM, of the service. They embraced the cloud.
I have two more questions. One is around quality of data. So how did you maintain, how did you make sure that the data that's being collected, it's only coming in from like test centers, or is the patient allowed to enter their own data as well?
Yeah, so it's the same information that the state receives, and that's our design principle going forward. And therefore, we're working with entities that we and the state trust for that information, be it labs or providers.
So interesting from my own personal experience that there were multiple registries in California that were collecting people's information as sign-up sheets, and the registries were themselves not talking. So a person was appearing in multiple registries and was getting information or getting messages to come get their vaccine or to schedule their appointments multiple times because the registries are not talking to each other. Did you encounter anything similar?
So, I mean, I'll go deep on California for a second. So your state is unique in that you've got a northern and a southern registry. At some level, if we go to the highest level and we get out of the city and the county level registries and get out of like LA County or whatnot and go to either the southern or the northern registry, we're able to address some of those. Data quality is a problem, as it always is, but that's why we spend a lot of time looking at how accurate are these registries, who seems to be the greatest source of truth, and how we can continue to improve their fidelity. And it truly is a state-by-state decision. And it's fascinating to me just how it reflects the way that we've invested in healthcare across America. We don't have a national registry. It's good or bad, maybe depending on your political leaning. The state registries, some of them are incredible, some of them are working, let's leave it at that. It's just a very interesting phenomenon. Maybe my closing point here would be, I was on a webinar last week with the organization that really looks after a lot of these immunization gateways, and their amazing stat was that the investment in these has been flat for the last decade. There's this thing called inflation and innovation, and it's pretty hard to do that on a flat budget. So, kudos to the folks that are making these registries work and are keeping them as accurate as they are, because I know it's incredibly important work that no one realized until about 18 months ago.
I definitely agree. And healthcare is still in very nuanced stages of development. There's so much work that we need to do, and just cleaning up the data. There's too much information, too much noise. And I think a huge potential for all of us to come together, put our brains together to make it something that similarly or even like remotely looks like it's working actually. So thank you so much. This was really, really insightful. I appreciate you sharing such details, and thank you for answering all the questions that I had. If our listeners have any additional questions, please feel free to type in for Chris, and I will share them around here. Then moving on to you, Charles. I've read a lot about the work that ARCUS is doing, and your team has done quite a breadth of work around COVID-19 crisis responses. So my first question to you is, how did you and your team navigate the landscape when all these data sources, reporting structures are not formalized? And in your own words, the initial players that came in were not experts. How did you start off with?
Yeah, so frankly, we were brought in a little bit after others had failed, and so try to help pick up some pieces along the way to that point in crisis response. State testing contracts and otherwise went to groups and individuals that were not necessarily experts in their space or in that space, and we're cobbling together systems that had different let's say potentials and capabilities, especially from a data integration as well as just general database perspective. And so where we came in farther down the line in terms of the solution that we helped solve in a number of states, but which was more in the post-testing care element of a patient's continuum of care. But in working there, we saw earlier in that continuum what was happening with the databases that were set up, the integration between those databases or lack thereof, the access to those databases or lack thereof, and otherwise. And that's why with Lydian and what we're looking at going forward is trying to access back into some of that information for higher resolution, fidelity, and otherwise, so that we all can retrospectively look back and evaluate over time, whether that be crisis response or identify mine areas of interest for the future from a care perspective or otherwise. It's as Chris probably knows, it's a highly fragmented space, not only from, even if we look at individual EMRs, where demographic information is warehoused in one part of a database, whereas the actual kind of consultative information is sitting on an Oracle database. And how does that work together, or from the actual like encounter on the EM basis or otherwise? So how do you get to that information? How do you bring it together, access it, and obviously do that within a regulatory frame, HIPAA compliant regulatory framework, and the rest, and keeping that security and privatization of that data. So it's a complex problem that was made more complex by the nature of response that we saw in the states that we worked in, and so we're focusing first on trying to put in a solution in one region or geography, and then trying to broaden that out over time.
Interesting. So did you build a whole new database that collected information from all these different sources, or did you leverage something that was existing and customize it?
Well, right now we're working on, in this instance, we're working on something that is more distributed and based upon the Lydian data economic network and platform about how to access that into the future using our insights from working within the space, especially as it relates to the early data that was collected and potentially available for that look back into response and otherwise. Secondarily, and also to Chris's point, data fidelity in, let's say, looking at negative results throughout a state or city, and trying to match that up against operational efficiency, and was there any causal reasons there why that data should be in the future be weighted in one way or another, whether it be looking back academically or looking back from a government agency perspective, or looking back from or looking forward and trying to look at communities and whether or not what should be the expectations with that community from a COVID perspective in their long-term health and otherwise, and what especially in the underserved areas where we saw potential reasons for how to provide care and the rest in the future.
So are you working within this framework of data economics? Are you working on defining what labels should be used and how these labels are scored? Is that something that you're just leveraging what is existing in the system right now and changing and repurposing the data around it?
We're looking to really at first access within the systems generally, and going to those points of aggregation that are there within the systems. There were not only testing labs, but there were middleware providers or otherwise that were stood up or implemented, and where we might be able to access those pieces of data and bring those together in ways that are meaningful. But to your point, also. We have to look out for redundancy and the rest. So it is definitely a work in progress to get there. We have our own data set that from our own work that is something that we look at and try to use as establishing the basic values that we'll be able to build off of and then move from there in the future.
Can you elaborate on one of the use cases of this data and something? Can you share a little bit in detail?
Sure. So I look at operationally, just even if we were going to take this and say, without outside of all patient information or otherwise, when was the sample? When did a patient register? When was their sample collected? When was the sample processed? When was that result reported back to the patient? When was that result potentially reported back to state agency? Were there gaps? And there especially in the early days, there were gaps there. And so let's look at like a negative result. Well, did that negative result come at 4 days post collection? Well, now we have to start weighting that negative result for whether it be government agencies or academia or otherwise taking a look at that and the rest. So we and what the negative or positivity rate was in that area. So those would be ways that we would even look at just from an operational perspective and putting that against what we saw as positivity rates over time and how maybe others should weight those.
So what sources, are you just working with registries, with labs, or are you also working with, say, hospital systems to gather data? And is this data only limited to just COVID testing? Or are you tracking data beyond the patient infection, patient recovery? Like how far is your spread?
Currently very limited. So right now, but concentrated on purpose. So we are working again with the providers and talking with them as to how we bring this together, how we solve the problems or the issues that Chris highlights, right, in terms of HIPAA and privacy and otherwise. And we actually think that the framework that that Lydian is putting together really lends itself to those elements and to be bring that data together in terms of the ability for those entities to control access to that data and how it's accessed and otherwise. That's where we are today.
You bring up a great point about control to access to data. In this project that you're currently engaged with Lydian and with crisis response, how much has been a headache around the federal and the state government level restrictions and policies, and what are the key challenges, and what could you do if you had known this was going to come your way?
When we stepped into it, we had let's say there was a lot of friction in the geographies that we worked in between state, local, and federal in terms of what that response was looking like and different stakeholder interests or values in how things were rolled out or put together, which led to different levels of data quality. And to the point that Chris was making is where is the bar? What are we trying to achieve or not? And those different stakeholders had different interests at different times, especially given some communities' history with different data and what it's been used for or otherwise, and whether or not to collect that data, whether to report that data, what to do with it, and what was the main goal in each step of what was trying to be accomplished. So what would be the suggestion out of this? To look back from this and really take the lessons of it. I know that we've similarly done that in 2003, there have been playbooks previously. Looking back again, trying to improve on that, trying to make sure that that the next time, because there probably will be some event in the next time of a next time, but that it doesn't become an event. And that and at least some framework or thought process, whether at a local, state, or federal level, is in place, because that was all happening a little bit on the fly. I mean, we were on the phone calls as that was getting sussed out. So yes, so just a little bit more preparedness.
Yeah, data has been changing, and it's constantly changing, especially around COVID, which makes me wonder that we are getting good at crisis responses, be it COVID-19. Prior to that, we had Ebola. Prior to that, we had SARS. All these chronic but acute onset of conditions that came in. What learnings can we take from this and put it on to something which is like an annual crisis, like we have flu seasons? Do you think the learnings from this framework can be put in to something that we know is coming, which is not like unknown crisis, but something we know to expect?
This is
hurricane season.
Sure, and let's even in the kind of the more direct comparison in the healthcare space, right? We sit here and we have this discussion frequently, and are trying to figure out what the market will hold, as well as then what will government agencies step in and do from the point of view of infection control, and whether or not whether it's just flu season or whether it is further pandemic or otherwise in the future. Obviously, there's the government side and the public side, but then there's also the private side, and we deal with it every day as, let's just say, a restaurant in our own. Where is the point that they're going to implement infection control or not? And from that point of view, also then the data that may be sitting behind that infection control protocol. For instance, there's a company that we work with out of Canada that is an AI engine on symptom screening that works with multispectral cameras and looks at everything from core body temperature measured at the corners of your eyes to scanning your face to look for other signs of congestion or headache or blood pressure or things of that nature. Where does that play in the future or not? Would you, as a restaurant, want that at your front door to see whether or not somebody's showing the symptom of infectious disease before they enter into your site? Or do you want that for your employees? Or is it something else? And where does that all play in? And on the backside of that, what happens with the data, right? And so I think we're in our perception in our conversation is that we are still in a space of investigation in that market space, particularly in the private marketplace, about what is it going to be and what isn't going to be, isn't it going to be? So yeah, it definitely in development.
That brings me to my next question, talking about markets. You've worked extensively in US as well as in China. So say a project like what you're doing with Lydian, what do you think the challenges would be if we wanted to do that in China? What are the key takeaways, key differences?
So China, a completely different environment. Right now in China, the digitization of data is still an ongoing project. No companies there that are doing that, and not obviously on behalf of the government. You look at distributed databases and their work there, whether it be in healthcare or otherwise, they're doing work out of their national strategic labs. They have a national strategic lab on IoT. They have a national strategic lab on blockchain. They have a national strategic lab or otherwise, which is a coming together of government, academia, and private industry, which also have all ties to each other in already kind of in through that. So they're approaching that. This type of federated data, distributed data base thought process is something they're very engaged in. I would also look at outside of this in finance and what they're doing there with the digitization of the RMB, particularly as we look at kind of their geopolitical strategy and otherwise, and maybe, right now they're considering on different vectors financially, especially in terms of globalization of the RMB. They're significantly behind where the United States is, and their digitization of the RMB is something that's a prime point of interest in their development. So healthcare, a little bit different, still earlier, but in terms of their thinking about this, yeah, it's definitely some of point.
Interesting. So, but when at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that we have so many different data sources. We're trying to bring them all in together. There's a lot of noise in the data. Different databases have different structures, and none of it is formalized or even harmonized. Will a country like China, where there's a government organization basically spearheading all these data collection and data analytics, would make it easier because you have one standard format? Or is just the data structure formatting similar plague that plagues China that has in the US?
Yeah, I would also, from a Chinese perspective, you'd also look at what the infrastructure is that's there from the healthcare perspective. A hospital in a tier 3 city is completely different than that in a tier 1 city. The amount of funding that it gets or otherwise is completely different. And so you really have a much larger stratification than you do here in the United States in terms of healthcare and what's underlying it from each perspective. So that the idea that to come in top down, while potentially more aligned, or potentially the structure of government and its ability to implement being more aligned with that, there is such a much larger stratification in terms of where people are and their abilities and capabilities and otherwise, that it becomes more even more difficult actually.
Good. I have just one question, and that is, for a company that's starting to do work on federated data analytics, we've all learned that now pandemics are global. You can't just look at data in US or look at data in China or look at data in India and think about it. What is your one piece of advice to companies, startups thinking about venturing in this space in terms of like international value of data and how to go around it?
You know, what Chris said earlier really resonated with me in a lot of ways in terms of whether or not you're just doing something incremental or at the margin, or whether you're doing something truly transformative and how in bringing something together. That, you know, we it's one of the reasons why I was so interested in working with when I first met Jennifer and then Arik and Sertash and the rest of the team at Lydian. That's why I was so interested in what they were doing, particularly as it allows for both implementation against the existing structure, as well as a foundation for developing structures in the future, especially if we look at countries that are still developing those structures, whether that be China, which we love to talk about, or otherwise, right? And there's a lot of other countries where this type of platform might be even more beneficial and practical in its implementation. And so that I guess that would be more along the lines of what my comment would be in general.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this, Charles. This is very, very valuable. So jumping on to you, Tanvi, I know I'm a couple minutes over, but I'll try my best. As a soon-to-be researchers, congratulations again. As soon-to-be researcher at Cambridge, how much do you think data silos are going to affect the value of distributed data?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of an interesting question, right? Because even in my work and in the strategy consulting space, like working with, so I've previously worked with like payers, medical device companies, and also pharma, and work very closely with the Emory Healthcare Innovation Hub now, so Emory Hospital. And one of the things that I've noticed that I think is interesting is that each of them operate in data in these silos, right? Essentially, so like even clinical trials research, like there's very limited data sharing across organizations. In industry, like there's an incentive for that. But even like with hospitals, like when they're trying to collaborate, like there are like clear research silos, and that has everything to do with HIPAA compliance, like patient privacy, and then also to some degree, like the organization of the data. So it's just not structured in a way that makes it easy to share, which makes, I think, so like we've looked at like encryption efforts, right? How can we like encrypt data to be able to do different types of modeling efforts on it? And that gets like very, very complicated. I think federated analytics specifically is really interesting and has a lot of implications for research, because it allows us to run the same models on like a variety of data sets. I think, so my space is like, my research space is clinical imaging, specifically for hepatocellular carcinoma, which is just like liver cancer in layman's terms. And it's like, it's pretty cool, because if you develop a predictive model for something like liver cancer, there are a lot of components of it you can use across like pathologies. And then also like there are different types of populations that this model is applicable to. So like for liver cancer specifically, you would look at different types of patient populations. Like one would be patient populations in like developed countries or like advanced economies, I guess. And then there's also like developing countries, and like liver cancer is really prevalent in both, but the pathology of it is a little bit different. Like the causes are different. And also like if you're looking at like bias, right, in the patient population, any sort of like diagnostics or like prognostics are going to be inaccurate if they're representative of a single population. However, with something like federated analytics, like you can translate those models across populations without having to actually share the data, which I mean has like massive implications. Particularly like what I'm really interested in, and I think this is probably like by nature of my background, is like research is really fantastic and awesome, and it's really exciting to see new and innovative things happen. But there's a huge gap in discovering new things and taking those discoveries and operationalizing them, right? And I think that's like a lot of the time, like when things are operationalized from like academic research, it's done by industry, but then industry operates in very specific types of silos because they have personal incentives, like, which is just like, I mean, you're not going to want to develop something and put R&D into something and then have everybody know about it. However, like I think that insofar as academic institutions are able to operationalize a certain level of basic research, more people, it'll be advantageous, like across, like I think the healthcare ecosystem. And also it has implications globally. So like I'm doing my PhD in the UK. Like when you look at the US, there's like, I mean, the US's healthcare system is interesting when it comes to data sharing. There's lots and lots and lots of difficulty, like Chris kind of talked about, between when you look at it state to state, but even like healthcare system to healthcare system, or if you're looking at someone who has like a PCP, but like needs to go to a specialist, like there's tons of issues, just even like getting like data between the like, I guess like the specialist, the PCP, sorry, like, or like a healthcare system to a external provider. The UK is interesting because even though data is like, or even though it's a centralized healthcare system, there are still issues with data. I think only like, there's been an effort to digitize like the EMR there, like only like 40% of it is online. Like a lot of it is still paper. So I think like there are strides to be made, but, and like it's going to be very difficult to get everyone's patient information in digital format and then encrypt it. So I think federated analytics is interesting there too, because it removes the need to do all of the legwork that's involved in like fully digitizing healthcare. So I think it's kind of like a means to an end in a way as well.
That's very interesting, because I had a question that I wanted to ask you about it. Like, even when hospital systems or labs, they try to share data and they can't, but they're still limited to the data around the patients that come to them. So there is an inherent sampling bias, because you can only collect and analyze data of the people who come to you, you can't go out into a country that's completely different and get a different demographics, a different sample size. So what would be an approach to take with this case? Because federated analytics is just taking the insights out of data. You still need to compare your raw data set with the other hospital's raw data set to see where your biases are.
So, I mean, I think clinical trial bias is interesting, because I think there's a difference between bias and having like characteristic populations for certain areas. So like, for example, like the Southeast of the United States is going to have a patient population that's like distinctly different than like, for example, a certain part of Canada. A good example of this is actually like, if you look at like chronic kidney disease and like the TANVI model, like there's a lot of like commentary on how that model is not really like applicable to other patient populations, but it's not because there was like a significant amount of like bias in its development. It's because like that research was conducted in Canada, and Canada just doesn't have the same like demographic breakdown that like other like that parts of the United States have, for example. So like the like way you would evaluate like risk for kidney disease, like with the TANVI model, which is a fantastic model, like it's been validated, it's like excellent. And actually like they've even like Kaiser, for example, tried to replicate it in like, I think both in California and in like the Southwest, and like ended up like the TANVI model is like a great model. However, like its patient population excludes like certain minority populations that you'll see in parts of the United States. So I think it's less about like bias and more about needing models to be flexible enough to produce the correct like results and predictions for the patient population that they're being employed for. I think clinical trial bias really occurs most often in like, for example, in pharma, when they're like, you kind of self-select for the patient population, or like there's like a pharma company, for example, that like they have like a diabetes drug that's very popular, and they were a client of mine. They do these surveys of like a diabetic patient population, but they kind of like, I think they call them their like A1ers or something. It's their group of diabetics that they go ask questions to about like how do you feel about XYZ? And like, to me, that's like an example of clinical bias, because like the way they've selected that population is most likely biased. It's people who are being paid for their opinions to some extent. Like they're like the type of people that are willing to be like involved and responsive. So I think there you see clinical actual, like what I would consider bias versus like, I think like a patient population that's representative of the area that the research is occurring in. I mean, that's kind of like bias, but I think that it's important to have models like be specific to certain populations because that's where they're most effective. So like, I think the ability to train models and gear them to populations, but then being able to reuse the model is valuable.
Also, evolving the model as time proceeds and as we keep learning becomes important, because what we saw in the early months of the COVID-19 crisis last year was, oh, these certain populations are more susceptible to the condition. A certain age group is more likely to not have any symptoms, etc. And as the model learns and gets more data, we are learning that all the initial understandings or conclusions were kind of not correct. But you bring up a great point about asking patients for their information, because we have seen this even in like digital patient solutioning as well, that when you go ask targeted questions to a group of users, a group of patients, they base it out from their own personal experience. And the bias is, if we just rely on that data, then the bias becomes apparent that you're only catering to the A-lister patients. So then let me ask you this. Do you see in the coming years, this federated data analytics, and how much commercialization is going to occur, and what kind of challenges if a company tries to commercialize these analytics?
I think it's kind of inevitable that commercialization is going to occur. I mean, it's very lucrative, right? To commercialize something like this, especially since like really there's just tons of data everywhere. And so like commercializing like models where you can use different types of data sets, like you can build out one. So like you have like, right, like your analytics pipeline essentially, and you have a model that you can like train and retrain. It's incredibly lucrative, and there are insights that you can produce that you can sell. Like they have like, there's lots of utility there. I think that the difficulty is going to be in, I think there's just going to be like institutional red tape, like regardless. And also I think like, it's going to be interesting to see how industry interacts with academic institutions in order to do this. Also, like, I think there are ethical implications to how you would use something like this. So I think it's definitely going to be commercialized. I think in like the oncology space or like the clinical imaging space, like, which I can speak to a little bit more specifically, the commercial sector like can benefit a lot from using it. And I think that there's an intersection between like the public and private sector there. Like it's generally beneficial to use like federated analytics in a commercial and non-commercial way, and to have overlap there, because I think like when someone has something like cancer, like there's a large like patient journey, and like everybody like benefits from I guess like improving the innovation and technology there. I think like when it comes to something like digital twins, or when you're creating like digital versions of people and like assessing all different types of things about them, and you're training and retraining predictive models to do that, that's kind of interesting. And I'm like, I don't know, like, I think that like very easily, like if there's a commercial incentive to create something and there's a timeline there, like you could create something that's representative of one population and sort of inaccurate for others. And I think that the implications of that are kind of interesting, because I'm seeing this like whole concept of digital twins when we're looking at like biomarkers and genomics and things like SDOH like manifest themselves. And I think like a lot of that is like based on a set of assumptions, and if those assumptions are wrong, it could play out in a very interesting manner.
The market will tell.
Yeah, and I mean also like how they're used. So
yes,
but it's very like Gattaca.
Well, thank you so much. That was very insightful. I want to open the stage to question and answers. And if our attendees have any questions, please feel free to direct it to us through the chat or raise your hands and we can let you answer. Ooh, I see crickets. I think that the conversation was a little too heavy for everybody, or am I missing the chats that are coming through? Sartaj, can you see?
Oh, I see one question coming through on the Q&A. Question for Chris.
It's a question for Chris. So.
Oh, wait, but I don't think the person finished. You didn't want us to sign off.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Okay, I see that. I was looking in the chat. How do I? But I don't think I can read the Q&A, so it might require you.
Yeah, I can't either.
Yeah, I just give the attendee a second. Oh, there we go.
So the question is, what are the other use cases for the technology that Chris, you described for use that was used in New York? So how can we use that technology in other ways?
Yeah, so what we have proven is an ability to demonstrate trust and facts in a distributed manner. And I alluded to the fact that we really don't geek out on the technology, but it's something that blockchain and cryptography are making possible. And so if you think about your COVID vaccination status or your COVID test status as a fact about yourself and something you hold dear and that you want to control access to, but also if you decide to share it with someone, you want them to trust, to know that this is a true piece of information. We have a mechanism now of doing that. So think about other attributes of your life that you want to be in control of, but when you share them, the other party wants to know that you're not faking it. And if you define that as the universe, the use cases are enormous. And those are the conversations that we're in.
Do we have any other questions?
I think that's it. I don't see anything else coming in.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris, Charles, and Tanvi for giving us your time this afternoon. And I want to extend my thank you to our attendees. Thank you so much for listening in. This was quite an informative session for me, and I hope you found value in it too. And so I guess I'll see you guys at some other session. Have a great rest of your evening. Thank you.